Good evening, everyone. We'll get started. We're being Italian fashionably late with about a 5-minute delay, but we're very excited to have you all here. It's so nice to see so many people coming out for the annual Josephine von Henneberg Lecture in Italian Art. I welcome you all and thank you all for coming, and a special shout out to all of the students in the room, including my students who are here to hear from a scholar and speaker whom we've been reading in class. So it's very exciting to have Professor Holly Flora with us this evening. Before my colleague John Lansdowne introduces our speaker, Professor Holly Flora from Tulane University, I would just like to say a few words about this lecture series, which many of you know and love as much as all of we do in the department. This lecture series was established by my predecessor in Italian art, Josephine von Henneberg, who was professor at Boston College for 40 years. And her outstanding career extended the study of Italian art at Boston College. And when she retired around the year 2000, 2001, if I'm remembering all of the dates correctly, she decided to leave us a wonderful legacy. And that legacy was to endow this lecture series so that every year we would be able to bring an eminent historian, art historian of Italian art to campus in order to enrich our community and to enrich the learning that takes place in our classrooms. And we were moved a couple of years ago. Sadly, Josephine passed away in 2023. We did celebrate her life and all of her achievements here together in this very space. And we talked about the many accomplishments of her career, including the numerous students that she taught here at Boston College. And there were a lot of recollections about how she impacted those students. We reminisced about her publications on Renaissance and Baroque Rome. We even talked a bit about how she was rather defiant in the face of fascism in Italy in the 1930s. So Josephine led a very full and rich life, and it's that life that she celebrated here with her students. It was the reason why she loved art history so much. She was both very much moved and passionate about the art, but she always emphasized the humans behind the artists making the art, the people looking at the art. And that's why we're so happy to be able to come together every year and celebrate Italian art and celebrate the very new and innovative scholarship that is continuing to take place in Italian art. And this year it's extra special because our speaker is going to be talking about a subject that relates to the exhibition that John Lansdowne, Professor John Lansdowne, and I have curated upstairs. So we're very pleased that we can bring together the exhibition, the celebration of Josephine's passion and study of Italian art, our current students and the current study of Italian art at Boston College, and welcome and invite our speaker, Holly Flora, to Boston College. So I will now turn this over to my colleague, John, who will more fully introduce Professor Flora. Thank you.
Thank you. You can clap for Stephanie. Absolutely. Holly Flora is Professor of Art History in the Newcomb Art Department at Tulane University, where she also is Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the School of Liberal Arts. Her scholarly work explores the themes of narrative, imagination, materiality, and gender in the devotional art of late medieval and early Renaissance Italy. So really exploring that great area on the Trecento and the Quattrocento that our exhibition upstairs is exploring. Holly is the author of The Devout Belief of the Imagination, published by Brepols in 2009, a work on a very important medieval manuscript in female Franciscan spirituality in Trecento, Italy. Her work has been published in numerous major journals, including Gesta, Icon, Art History, I Tatti Studies, Studies in Iconography, and her 2018 book, Cimabue and the Franciscans, was awarded the Premio San Francesco from the Pontifical Institute of St. Anthony in Rome. Holly received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University and worked in the museum world in New York City prior to moving over to Tulane. And it was during that time in the museum world where she actually, as an Andrew Memorial Fellow at the Frick Collection in New York, curated the 2006 exhibition, Cimabue, an Early Italian Devotional Painting. She has many important fellowships, places connecting with and supporting her research, including from the American Association of University Women, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Scuola Normale di Pisa, Villa I Tatti in Florence, and the American Academy in Rome, where she was awarded the Rome Prize in Medieval Studies. Holly is a committed teacher to undergraduate and graduate students and an exceptionally generous mentor to junior scholars. This is something I can attest to. We're really thrilled here to have her here for the exhibition, and once again, to kind of paint that the exact transitional period between the medieval and the Renaissance that we are exploring all this semester. In sum, please join me in welcoming Holly.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? I'm wired, so hopefully this will go okay. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for this incredible and generous introduction. I am absolutely thrilled and honored to be here today speaking to you as your Josephine von Henneberg lecturer. And I'm especially excited that my visit aligns with the exhibition, which if you haven't seen, you must see. I think the museum is open until 8, right? So you can see it even after the talk if you want. So the exhibition really asks us to think about how we can consider and also resist these words we've heard a lot, medieval and Renaissance, these traditional categories of periodization. And this is really at the heart of much of my research into religious art in Italy in the 13th and 14th centuries. The artist Cimabue, who lived from circa 1240 to 1301, has occupied my thinking now off and on for more than 20 years. And he's often celebrated as the evolutionary link between the two eras. Renaissance writers much later, including George of Vasari in the mid-16th century, declared Cimabue to be the first in a line of usually male genius artists, mostly from Florence, to break away from a more schematic, what we might today call medieval style, inaugurating the Renaissance rediscovery of, quote, naturalism and classical antiquity. Now, Vasari likely had in mind a comparison like this one you see on the screen. These are two paintings made at about the same time, 1280, both by Florentine painters. On the left, you'll see a painting by someone whose name is lost to us. We only know this person as the Magdalene Master. And on the right, you'll see the same subject, Madonna and Child enthroned with angels, by Cimabue. And you can see here in this rather obvious comparison that the Magdalene Master has a really rather more schematic, we might say, depiction of drapery and facial features, and a frontal throne pushed forward against the picture plane, and the figures around sort of placed around the Madonna like little paper doll cutouts. And in contrast, Cimabue uses a more subtle gradation of light and shadow to render facial features and drapery. And he also angles the throne on a diagonal to create a more convincing sense of receding space. So I'll say up front that I think this kind of comparison, which is of course something we still do a lot in art history, tells only part of the story. We have to remember, of course, that naturalism is in itself a highly subjective concept. And naturalism or optical realism isn't always the goal of art. And maybe it shouldn't always be. And by the way, I should also say that I think the Magdalene Master is actually a fantastic artist. So in my book, Cimabue and the Franciscans, I wanted to complicate some of the traditional ideas about this so-called transition period between medieval and Renaissance, including kind of interrogating the idea of the privileging of male genius artists like Cimabue, which might sound like a strange thing to say when I wrote a book about the male genius artist Cimabue. But I argued that while Cimabue was, in fact, and I did become convinced of this despite any skepticism I once had, that he was a tremendously, incredibly talented innovator and actually under-celebrated for his achievements. But I really began to think about how he was only one of many interrelated, I would call agents of change in the time. So I contended, and I argued in my book, that his most revolutionary works can be connected to his primary patrons, members of the Franciscan order, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, who you can see here in a painting by Cimabue, now in Assisi, in the lower church. Francis, as you may know, lived from circa 1181 to 1226. And he was famous for a variety of things, including a spirituality marked by the devotion to holy poverty. The Franciscans were among the most successful of the new mendicant religious orders that emerged in the 13th century. As opposed to living a cloistered monastic life, mendicant friars, so they're friars, not monks, this is very important, they combined two aspects of the ideal Christian life, combining what Christians call the active life, the itinerant life of preaching and charity, with the contemplative life, the idea of meditation and quiet Christian contemplation. So for the Franciscans, Francis embodied both of these two ways, what we call the vita mixta. And in his contemplative life, Francis was ardently, passionately devoted to the Passion of Christ, his physical pain, his suffering, his crucifixion. And the practice that Francis pioneered of meditating intently on the crucified Christ led eventually to a mystical encounter where he received the stigmata, a physical imprint of Christ's wounds into his hands, feet, and side, as shown here in Giotto's panel, which was made for the Franciscan church in Pisa, and it's now today in the Louvre. So in part because of this miracle, Christ's crucifixion became an essential part of what we might today call the Franciscan brand. We also know that an image of Christ on the cross was crucial to Francis's conversion to the religious life in the first place. According to his biographers, the young, spoiled Francis, who was a son of a rich cloth merchant, we'll get back to that in Assisi, he once took a walk in the fields on the outskirts of town. He came upon this dilapidated church dedicated to St. Damian, San Damiano. He went inside and he began to pray. He prayed before what Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, his biographer, tells us, an image of Christ crucified. Suddenly, to quote Bonaventure, while his tear-filled eyes were gazing at the Lord's cross, he heard with his bodily ears a voice coming from that cross. The voice commanded him to, quote, rebuild my church. This miraculous encounter with the talking crucifix led to Francis's devotion to poverty, his spiritual transformation, and eventually his creation of the Franciscan order. Now, although Francis's biographers did not specify the medium of the image of Christ crucified, tradition holds that it was a painted cross, like the one that Giotto depicts here in this painting that was done circa 1290. Now, by painted cross, I mean a painting like this one that's shown on the altar here, not simply an image of Christ on the cross, but one painted on a wooden panel in the form of a cross, or what we might call in Italian, a croce dipinta. You can see a fabulous example of a croce dipinta in the exhibition. We will return to this fascinating work in just a bit. In tonight's lecture, I will be focusing on the impact of the Franciscans on this kind of work of art. I hope that examining Franciscan painted crosses, their iconography, their function, their format, can help shed light on and also complicate our ideas about the artistic changes we see in the 13th century in particular, in the space between, quote, medieval and Renaissance. So my talk has three parts. In the first, I will discuss the Franciscan influence on the popularization and evolution of painted crosses. Then I will highlight Cimabue's revolutionary crucifix made for the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence. And I will return here briefly to some of the ideas I presented in the book, but hopefully also saying something new. And I know a number of you have been reading some of my work on this cross. At the end, I'll talk about the exciting discovery of a small panel by Cimabue found in 2019 in a woman's kitchen in France, which I affectionately call the kitchen Cimabue. So the discovery of the kitchen Cimabue happened after my book was published. So it was not included in the book. So I hope to have something new to say about this work. And the kitchen Cimabue did not come from a cross, as we'll see, but it formed part of a narrative devotional work that I will argue is very much inspired by the phenomenon of the Croce Dipinta. So starting in the 12th century, so even before Francis's time, painted crosses like the one Giotto depicted were becoming increasingly common in churches in Italy. Examples survive in various sizes, some smaller, some larger, and some seem to have been destined for altars, as seen in the fresco here. By the mid-13th century, we see monumental, larger crosses placed at the center of worship spaces, particularly in the churches of the mendicant orders like the Franciscans. As you can see here in a fresco also by Giotto from the same cycle in Assisi, depicting the death of Francis, a painted cross is at the center of a triad of paintings placed atop a beam. And sometimes these paintings would also be on top of a screen, as we'll see, or what we call in Italian a tramezzo, that separated the area around the high altar from the rest of the nave of the church. In another fresco from the Giotto series in Assisi, we can see the back of a painted cross placed on top of a screen in this case, facing a group of women attending Francis's celebration of the first live-action nativity mass at Brepols. Here, friars and laymen witness the event inside the screens. You can see them here. Hopefully my little pointer can address those screens. Here's the women. There's a group of men and friars. So they are inside and the women in this case are outside. So to anyone outside the screen, and it wasn't always just the women, it was often members of the laity more generally, mass would be heard from that sort of exterior space, if you will. So the painted cross became the visual focal point for those gathered to hear mass. Perhaps I would say even helping them to experience what has sometimes been termed ocular communion, or the idea that one might experience visually the miracle that was happening in mass, where the body and blood of Christ became miraculously present in the bread and wine in the ceremony in the Eucharist. So the emphasis on the Eucharist, and in particular, the emphasis on the act of transubstantiation, the idea that the bread and the wine actually physically become the body and blood of Christ in this moment, was especially pronounced in the Latin West after the year 1215. And that's still during Francis's lifetime, by the way. In that year, the Fourth Lateran Council reified or sort of said, yes, this is actually true. This is the doctrine of transubstantiation. So in the decades following this council, we might say that the Croce Dipinta as a thing went viral in Italy. So we have a lot of examples that survive from this period. Many centuries later, the modern historians of Italian art began studying paintings from this period, and they started referring to this phenomenon, the creation of these painted crosses, the Croce Dipinta, also as a thing. So, Croce Dipinta, the term itself, John and I were trying to figure out where that actually started, but I actually think it probably started with a female scholar called Evelyn Sandberg-Vallat, who in 1929 wrote a landmark study on the Croce Dipinta in Italia, and that's what you see here. So the idea of a painted cross as a special type of object is still very current, and even more recently, I would say, but another landmark study from 2016 actually celebrated the importance of painted crosses specifically for Francis and for the Franciscans. And I could name other studies as well. So as these studies have shown, there was a profound shift in this period post Fourth Lateran Council in the iconography of the crucified Christ. So before then, if we're talking about the 12th century, the many Italian crosses that we have that survive resembled this one. This cross is the cross that is traditionally thought to be the miraculous cross that spoke to Francis. And if you're familiar with the Franciscans, and if you've been to Assisi, you've seen images of this cross kind of everywhere, and icons and pilgrim badges and things like that with this cross. So this cross dates to the mid-12th century, maybe around 1140, and it features an image of Christ nailed to the cross, flanked by angels and other human witnesses to the event, including the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. Christ, importantly here, is shown alive on the cross. his body seemingly unaffected by gravity or the pain caused by the nails in his hands and feet. He is what we call a Christus triumphans, or Latin for triumphant Christ. He's a Stoic Lord, one who has won the battle with death. In 1236, so about a decade after Francis's death, one of Francis's first followers, Elias of Cortona, commissioned a famous painted cross from the Pisan artist Giunta Pisano. And this was originally made for the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Sadly, the cross I'm talking about is gone. It is lost to us, but a similar one is here, painted by the same artist, Giunta Pisano, around the same time for another important Franciscan site, Santa Maria degli Angeli in the valley below Assisi. Now here, in contrast to a Christ who gazes out at the viewer seemingly free from pain, Giunta's Christ, with his furrowed brow, his slumped head, his closed eyes, and his bent body, communicates the Savior's torturous death in clear terms. So comparing the older cross that spoke to Francis with Giunta's, we can see the change from a Christus triumphans to a Christus patiens, which means a suffering Christ. The Christus patiens was new to Italy in 1236, but it was current already in the Byzantine Empire. Elias of Cortona, in fact, perhaps saw a similarly expressive dead Christ on the cross during his travels to the Holy Land between 1217 and 1220. So in Italy, the Franciscans post-1236 popularized this type of crucifix with the Christus patiens. A number of similar crosses survive from Franciscan churches, such as this one, by an artist whose name is also lost to us, called the Maestro di San Francesco, and it was made around 1272 in Perugia. The Christus patiens type was quickly appropriated by other groups, other religious orders as well. But uniquely, the Franciscans stress its importance in relation to Francis specifically, often including a tiny, small image of their order's founder, of Francis, kneeling at Christ's feet. And you can see him at the base of this cross. And now I have a detail of this here. It's pretty fabulous. These miniature depictions of Francis, who's here shown with his own stigmatized hands gesturing towards the bleeding wound in Christ's foot, served as models of piety for the viewer. So this new type of cross was not only significant as a means for underscoring Francis's devotion to the crucified Christ that we've already talked about, but I think it also helped viewers engage in a process of redemptive vision. And I'm borrowing a term from a scholar and a friend of mine called Lynn Ransom. The idea is that fervent meditation on Christ's suffering could lead to spiritual or even physical transformation in the way that it had for Francis. So here, I want to underscore that meditation on Christ's passion, of course, it's something that all Christians were interested in, and it had a special relevance for the Franciscans because of Francis. But it was also a particular focus of the women who followed Francis. Saint Clare of Assisi, here in a fresco by Giotto, and here near her original convent of San Damiano in the photo here, was a wealthy young woman from Assisi who rebelled against her family's plans for her to marry so that she could join Francis's religious revolution. She took up residence here at San Damiano, the very spot, by the way, where Francis had the vision of the talking crucifix. So she founded the order's female branch, and this is the very spot. The women who joined her in devotion to Francis, who became known as Poor Clares, so poverty, Poor Clares, and Clare after her, or sometimes they were called Poor Ladies. Sometimes we refer to them as Clarissan nuns, just in a gesture towards the founder Clare. They professed devotion to Franciscan poverty, as Francis had as well. However, the church did not permit them to live itinerantly out in the world preaching and doing charity the way that the friars had. Instead, of course, church rules restricted the Clares to remain inside their convents, as had traditional nuns. So they couldn't live the full vita mixta, the mixed life of both the active life and the contemplative life. Their life was really centered on contemplation, the vita contemplativa. So for them, I think meditation on the Passion of Christ became especially important as a part of their daily lives. So it's not surprising that works of art from Clarissan convents, and we have a number of wonderful things, including painted crosses, attest to their special devotion to meditating on Christ's passion. As scholar Ann Derbies has pointed out, many of the painted crosses that survive from this period, we're talking about the mid-13th century and the late 13th century, like this one we're seeing here, were commissioned by the Poor Clares. It's actually an extraordinary number given what survives. In 1265, nuns from Clare's original convent at San Damiano that we just saw moved into the city proper, into Assisi. Some of you may have visited Santa Chiara, the Church of Santa Chiara in Assisi. They moved there. It was a newly founded convent, and they took the cross that had spoken to Francis with them. They also commissioned a new cross, the one that we see here, which was actually specifically commissioned by the abbess, the first abbess of Santa Chiara, who's called Benedetta, and she was commemorating the new church and convent. So Benedetta's image appears opposite that of Clare at the base of the cross and alongside Francis. So we're looking at a detail right now of the cross we just saw. So the inscription, what's fascinating is the inscription here says that Benedetta had basically had this made, had me made. The abbess, the Clarissan abbess Benedetta had me made right here. Her agency is also indicated by the small purse, seemingly heavy with coins, dangling from her clasped hands. Now, the handling of money was actually a sore spot for the Franciscans. And in art, money bags were often associated with avarice. So this detail is unusual, and I think actually rather surprising. It points to the abbess's generosity. But I also believe Benedetta's image is more than a sign of her largesse and prestige, although it certainly signaled those things. The now lost cross that Elias of Cortona commissioned, that we were just talking about, also had included an image of him in a similar position. And so by placing herself in the same spot, Benedetta aligns herself with the legacy of Francis's early followers. And deliberately as well, I think her image mirrors that of Clare on the other side, reminding not only the viewers, us, that Benedetta was the first abbess, but also that she was in herself, in her presence as leader, representing Clare for the followers in the convent. She also modeled devotion to Francis and the crucified Christ. So I also think that Benedetta herself, looking at this image, might imagine herself as appropriating the same kind of intimate connection with the physical suffering of Christ that Francis is showing us here too. So here, I think this is just a fantastic detail, the way that Francis is cradling the foot of Christ, pressing his face against the nail wound as streams of blood are raining downward over his stigmatized hand. So although we hear much more about Francis's connection to the crucified Christ, both in Franciscan literature and also in modern scholarship, I want to stress that Clare, too, was celebrated for her devotion to the physical suffering and specifically to the wounds of Christ, as her image on this cross also reminds us. So Clare's biographer, a man named Thomas of Celano, who also had written a biography of Francis, wrote this about her connection to the Lord's Passion. The weeping of the Lord's Passion is familiar to her. She, who now draws from the sacred wounds sentiments of bitter myrrh, now absorbs from them a more joyful sweetness. The weeping of Christ's suffering makes her as if intoxicated, and her memory continually brings back to her the one whom love has deeply impressed on her heart. She teaches the novices, those are the new nuns, to weep for Christ crucified. And what she teaches with words, she exemplifies with deeds. For often, while she exhorted them individually to this, her weeping anticipated her words. So for the nuns who followed her, Clare modeled an intense, ecstatic response to Christ crucified, one that might lead to mystical sweetness or even intoxication. For some reason, this makes me think of Beyonce's Drunken Love. So this idea of kind of drunkenness with the love for the crucified Christ. On the Croce Dipinta included in the exhibition, by the way, Clare appears also, indicating that this work too was probably made for a convent of the Poor Clares. Francis and Clare are most often, when we find them paired, when we see Clare and Francis together, we're looking at something that the poor Clares have commissioned. So the position of the two saints on the terminals of the cross, as you can see here, and I'll show you a detail right here, the lateral terminals of the cross. On the left, we have Francis, and on viewers' right, we have Clare, is a bit unusual. More typically, we see these figures in the spot where we were just seeing them in Benedetta's cross at the base of the cross. And more typically on these terminals, we see the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. And in this case, Mary and John the Evangelist are placed on either side of cross body. And they're holding up their hands to their faces in a gesture of mourning. It's an ancient gesture of mourning. And then Mary here gestures towards Christ's body with an open palm, kind of a pose that I think is derived from Byzantine icons, so the type of icon known as the hodegetria, which means the guide. So you can see she's sort of directing and guiding our attention to the body of the crucified Christ here. So Clare on the right terminal is in a way sort of doing a similar gesture. She's got a similar posture with head bowed and palm pressed against her cheek. But she's holding a bright red cross, which is what we call an attribute. Way we recognize a saint is by some object often that they're shown with that gives us a proper sense of their biography, some important things in their life, and how a way of recognizing them. So it's one of several attributes that are associated with Clare, and it emphasizes her devotion to Christ's crucifixion. So Clare, in a way that I think is distinctly her own, connected the crucified Christ to the concept of a spiritual mirror. And it's this idea that inspired the title of my talk tonight, and that I also want to kind of think about in relation to our ideas about the change between medieval and Renaissance art. So mirrors are, of course, a long-standing trope in Christian exegesis and in other traditions as well. Medieval writers really viewed mirrors as signaled many different things, including introspection, or the idea of self-scrutiny, looking into one's own heart. A mirror could also be a metaphor for glimpsing reflections of the divine and of trying to see and reflect the qualities of God in oneself. And it is this idea that Clare presents in a letter to the Bohemian princess who became a Franciscan, Agnes of Prague. Clare urged her to, and you can see the quote here, place your mind before the mirror of eternity. Place your soul in the brightness of his glory. Place your heart in the image of the divine essence and transform yourself by contemplation utterly into the image of his divinity, so that you may feel what his friends feel as they taste the hidden sweetness, here again, hidden sweetness, that God himself has set aside from the beginning for those who love him. So she returns to the mirror again in her fourth letter to Agnes a few years later, thinking of the mirror this time as an expression of Christ's humanity as well, and a tool for meditation. This is a short quote, there's more here, but I kept it short. Then in the depths of the same mirror, contemplate the ineffable charity which led him to suffer on the wood of the cross and die thereon the most shameful kind of death. Therefore, that mirror suspended on the wood of the cross, so again, Christ as the mirror, urged those who pass by to consider it, saying, all you who pass by the way, look and see if there is any suffering like my suffering. She's quoting from Lamentations here. So Clare here interprets Christ as a mirror reflecting eternity that through contemplation one can glimpse. She urges Agnes to feel what his friends feel, looking to the Virgin Mary and to Francis, I would say, and to other saints as models for understanding the hidden sweetness of God. A painted cross like this one, where Clare herself is represented, perhaps prompted the nuns to consider the duality of Christ's nature, both as divine, as mirror of eternity, but also as a mirror of human suffering. So the idea that a painted cross might help viewers understand the divine and the human natures of Christ might also help us to reconsider Cimabue's Santa Croce crucifix, painted for the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence around 1280. So this work is also often invoked in traditional art historical narratives as an example of the transition from medieval to Renaissance. And a comparison with his earlier cross, and these are both by Cimabue, by the way, painted for the Dominican Church in Arezzo, helps us to see why. While both feature the Christus Patien, the suffering Christ, that had become standard in the late 13th century, the Santa Croce crucifix has much softer, painterly brushstrokes contouring the musculature of Christ's body. The areas of his arms, for example, where the attenuated biceps meet the elbow, are articulated with deep areas of shadow, as opposed to the more schematic, sort of C-shaped lines we see at Arezzo. Similarly, the linear pattern denoting Christ's abdominal muscles at Arezzo, and this is something that John and I were talking about earlier today, is abandoned at Santa Croce in favor of a gentle roundness of form marked by subtle contrasts of light and shadow. Now, another key difference is the transparent loincloth on the Santa Croce cross. Here, the effect of light passing through the loincloth extends beyond the areas that cover his hips and thighs to the folds of drapery that fall away from his body, so that his torso seems gently bathed in golden light. So with the Santa Croce crucifix, we are invited to contemplate the softness and the vulnerability of Christ's human flesh, a topic that resonated especially, I've argued, with the Franciscans at Santa Croce at this moment. Now here, I just want to briefly revisit some of the ideas in the interest of our wider conversations around the phenomenon of Croce Dipinta. There's a lot more in the book, and you can look there. I should mention here too that in-depth studies, by the way, of Cimabue's cross, this one here, are surprisingly scant, not a lot of them, because unfortunately, it is the victim of a modern natural disaster. So in 1966, historic floods in Florence engulfed the church, nearly ruining Cimabue's crucifix. The cross became submerged in 20 feet of muddy Arno water. After the water receded, it caused the paint to blister, pulling away about 60% of the pigments. So here you can see a comparison of the cross prior to the floods, and those are the photos that I still have to use, and after. So I'll mostly be using photos from the cross taken before. A word now, too, about the cross's original setting. Although we have seen by 1280, the Croce Dipinta as a thing was well established, the friars of Santa Croce must have been especially interested in a novel version. The church itself is dedicated to Holy Cross, that's what Santa Croce means, and the church had a prized relic of the true cross, the actual piece of wood from Christ's cross. It is no surprise then that the friars there commissioned Cimabue, who is the leading painter of the moment, to paint a massive crucifix measuring over 14 feet high and 12.5 feet wide, probably intended to be placed over the tramezzo of the church, the screen. And this is a digital reconstruction of what this might have looked like originally, the placement of the Santa Croce crucifix, probably intended to be a focal point for worshipers during Mass. Now, by the way, just as an aside, if you're wondering whether it was a problem for the Franciscans, an order dedicated to apostolic poverty, to commission grand churches and sumptuous works of art, it was. It's actually a very complicated topic, and we can return to in the Q&A. But Santa Croce, actually, the friars there were at the heart and the center for many decades in some of the controversies around the observance of poverty. We can come back to that if you like. But in 1280, a spectacular novel, Croce Dipinta, would have helped to solidify the Franciscan brand in Florence, where the friars at Santa Croce were continually striving to outdo their other mendicant rivals around town, especially the Dominicans across town at Santa Maria Novella. If we look into Franciscan theology also, we can understand that the friars at Santa Croce had other reasons too to be interested in a crucifixion where Christ's skin receives special attention. Cimabue's novel emphasis on Christ's flesh would prompt meditation on the concept of the incarnation, the idea of God taking on human form. In the 2 decades before Cimabue painted his cross for Santa Croce, he was the former minister of general of the order, by the way, and kind of the leading Franciscan intellectual of his day. Bonaventure Bagnoregio wrote extensively on the concept of the incarnation. He explores the topic in depth in his Revoluquium, composed in 1257 as a training manual for friars studying theology. In this treatise, Bonaventure argues that it was essential for the Redeemer of mankind, for God, to become human. here are a couple of quotes from the Breviloquium that can help us understand this. He says, nor can humanity have recovered its friendship with God except by means of a suitable mediator who could touch God with one hand and humanity with the other, who would be likeness and friend of both, God-like in his divinity and like us in his humanity. He goes on in another part of this to say, now the flesh is the part of our being most evident to us, as well as the most distant from God. And so in order that this work might be designated in the most expressive manner, and what he's meaning is the idea of God coming to earth in human form, is to indicate better the humiliation of God and more profoundly explain the exaltation of our flesh. It is called not inanimation, but incarnation. So here Bonaventure asserts that the Redeemer, Christ, is likeness and like humanity, even in his divinity. And although he's not talking about a work of art, I think his comments recall the kind of age-old conundrum in Christian art, how to depict Jesus, who is both God and human in one. And typically artists sort of have to kind of pick, like lean one way or the other, right? So Bonaventure also then posits that a mediator taking on human flesh is integral to the process of redemption. And that's also what we see in the quotes here. And he ends, by the way, this whole section on the incarnation in the Breviloquium with a long discourse on the passion of Christ. And he says that the suffering of Christ is integral to the experience of his humanity. Quote, he suffered in his human nature an all-encompassing passion. And we're going to talk more about this idea of all-encompassing, not just in fact physical, but a passion that is also inward and is spiritual as well. And we'll get to that in a moment. So for Cimabue and for the friars at Santa Croce, the newly almost naked Christ, covered, but also not, by a see-through loincloth, would also, I think, have sparked contemplation on this idea of the incarnation. The transparent loincloth that Cimabue depicts here, although, again, it was not the very first example, guess who? The Byzantines, they did it first, but he's really the first person in Italy to make this a thing, is a striking and a really influential novelty for the time, and one that, as we're talking about, has, I think, a special meaning for the Franciscans, because the nakedness of Christ was equated with his poverty. And remember, Francis devoted his life to apostolic poverty, an essential tenet of the order. And in fact, Christ's nudity, the idea of the nakedness of Christ, was intimately connected with the idea of the nudity of Francis. Okay, stay with me. So the idea is that Francis, and we see this in a famous scene here from Assisi, when he has his moment of publicly renouncing the wealth his father had in his inheritance of his father's great wealth, he famously strips naked in the square in Assisi, and then the bishop comes and covers him up. So, by the way, this is one of only several instances in Francis's life. This is the most famous one, but one of only several instances in his life where he stripped naked, including one where he strips naked and runs around in the snow. So there's an 80s movie with Mickey Rourke about Francis that I refer you to watch if you haven't seen it. Anyway, so with this novel presentation of the transparent loincloth, a motif that would draw attention, I think, to the cloth itself, as well as enable viewing of the almost nude Christ, I think Cimabue's crucifix enabled contemplation of Francis's particular piety as a rich man who became poor, like Christ himself. Perhaps this is also, I think, why Cimabue chose not to include, or maybe in consultation with the friars, a miniature image of Francis at the foot of the cross, as in other examples that we have from this period. In effect, the near nudity of Christ allows Cimabue's crucifix to embody the idea of Francis's full conformity to Christ. In other words, a viewer understanding the kind of idea of Francis as the alter Christus would look at this cross and also think of Francis. So again, we might think of the cross, the idea of the cross as a mirror. Bonaventure, in fact, who is also the author of the officially sanctioned biography of Francis that dates to 1266, also used the metaphor of a mirror to compare Francis to Christ. He wrote in the Legenda Maior, quote, I consider Blessed Francis the holiest mirror of the holiness of the Lord, the image of his perfection. So although he does not include an image of Francis, I think Cimabue does want us to think about our own reaction to this scene of the crucifixion. So he does include figures of Mary and John the Evangelist, pretty standard iconography on the terminals of the cross. And that is the detail, by the way, that I used for the title slide of this talk. And by the way, I chose to use the detail of the cross in its current state, just because it's kind of a beautiful ruin, I think, but that's where it is placed on the cross. So often in this period, this is the Virgin Mary, and she's mourning, right? She's got her head cradled in her hand. And often when she is mourning, she is shown holding a small cloth against her face. And we can see this in the Arezzo crucifix, also by Cimabue. So this particular kind of cloth, it's a thing, it's called a mappa, and it resembles a kind of cloth called a maniple, which is carried by priests when celebrating the Eucharist. So at Arezzo, Cimabue shows this, and he actually depicts this maniple or this mappa made from sheer fabric. That's quite similar to what we see on the Santa Croce crucifix later. So this kind of sheer silk, by the way, was extremely expensive. It's probably a kind of fabric called gazzatum, which was made in Giza, Egypt, and had to be imported, of course, to Italy. So what's interesting is that at Santa Croce, the mappa is absent. We don't have it there. He doesn't include it. And so as I argued more fully in my book, I believe this omission could be intentional, designed to prompt viewers to consider the Virgin's special role as provider of Christ's clothing. So drawing upon earlier legends, Franciscan depictions of Christ's passion sometimes state that Mary took off her veil and used it to cover Christ's naked body, basically providing his loincloth. And this account actually appears in a popular devotional text that I've also written about called the Meditations on the Life of Christ, which was a devotional guide written by a friar for some Clarissan nuns. And the copy of this you can see here in the image on the right. So the very moment where Mary runs up to Christ and covers him up, it's really very, very rare in art. It almost never appears. And when it does, it is almost always in a work of art that was made for women, for the Poor Clares. And by the way, there's a painting at Wellesley that you can see nearby that might, I think it does, show this moment. It's slightly unclear, but you can see that in the upper register of the panel on the left, which, by the way, at the bottom shows the death of St. Clare. At the top, Christ is ascending the cross, and Mary has run up to him and is holding his loincloth and simultaneously shoving away one of the men behind her. So sort of really taking action here as Christ is headed to the cross. So really showing her agency. So small cloths like a mappa and a maniple, the priest cloth, were actually sometimes conflated with a veil in literature of the time. So I think the absence of this cloth, and maybe it's a stretch, but I think it could prompt viewers to remember how Mary gave her clothing to Christ, perhaps even the kind of see-through loincloth he wears here at Santa Croce. Now, whether or not Cimabue included this specific reference, the sheer loincloth, I think still might be understood as an allusion to the way Mary provided the flesh of her own body to clothe Christ as he became incarnate, right? So she is the one who gives him the flesh that makes him human. And it's a powerful allusion, I think, that connects her to the priesthood and also really marks her as the key divine intercessor. And so even though the Santa Croce crucifix was not commissioned by the Poor Clares, I would argue that their devotional interests shaped the implied, even iconographic connection to Mary and Christ's clothing. So Cimabue's transparent loincloth, directly and indirectly, by the way, inspired many later versions of this motif. A similarly see-through loincloth can be seen in the exhibition in a beautiful 14th century Venetian lamentation attributed to Niccolo di Pietro. So go see this upstairs. This scene where Christ's followers gather to mourn over his dead body after he's taken down from the cross is not, by the way, found in the Bible, but is inspired by late medieval devotional literature and also by depictions in, guess what, Byzantine art. It is one of many narrative episodes from Christ's Passion that also, I would say, went viral in the late medieval period and sometimes also appears on painted crosses. And this brings me to the final section of my talk, where I will consider how the Croce Dipinta genre also inspired new forms of visual storytelling in this period. So to get us there, we'll need to depart momentarily from our discussions of painted crosses to talk about the extraordinary discovery of an unknown Cimabue painting. In June of 2019, a small panel was found hanging in an elderly woman's kitchen outside Paris. The painting turned out to be an extremely rare work by Cimabue. By the way, one of only about 10 known works by Cimabue that exist at all. It sold at auction later that year for approximately 27 million US dollars. Now, a few weeks before the painting was sold by the auction house Acteon, I rushed to Paris, worried that a private collector would buy it and put it on their yacht, and that I might never have a chance to see it again. So here I am in 2019 at the offices of the art appraiser Eric Turquin, excited to see this unprecedented find. Fortunately, after its sale, the panel was declared a national treasure by the French government. And in 2023, it came into the collection of the Louvre. The slide here shows the panel as I saw it in 2019, and in its beautifully restored state today. So it was newly revealed this year, actually, in an exhibition at the Louvre that I was fortunate to be a part of. What was even more astonishing than this chance discovery of an unknown painting by Cimabue in 2019 was that it could be matched to two other panels from the same work. So many Italian paintings that are now scattered across the globe in museums and collections are actually fragments cut from larger works. And this was done in the 18th and 19th centuries mostly. And these paintings were then sold on the art market, especially to visitors to Italy during the Grand Tour. So the Flagellation of Christ at the Frick collection, which is on the right here, and the Virgin and Child Enthroned on the left, now in the National Gallery of London, were in fact cut from the same larger panel to which the kitchen painting also belonged. And so if you were to flip these around, you would see that the grain of the wood, the saw marks, and even the holes in the panels made by worms eating the wood match up, confirming that the three panels belonged together in this arrangement. And we're still missing one of these scenes. In fact, the three panels, along with the fourth that is still missing, once formed part of a single panel that formed the left half of a diptych with 8 scenes total, 4 on each of its two sort of wings. Evidence that has been published elsewhere by Dillian Gordon and also more recently Donald Cooper and Thomas Bull indicates that this work was likely made for a group of poor Clare nuns, and my own research has supported that contention too. Cimabue's diptych, I've argued, was entirely original in its format. So it's dated to around 1280, and it seems to have been the earliest work of art of its kind, featuring a series of narrative scenes without a central image like a crucifixion or a Virgin and Child Enthroned as a focal point. So this prioritization of narrative would prompt viewers to move through the life and passion of Christ as their eyes traveled from one scene to the next, almost as though reading the life of Christ through pictures, or we might think of it as almost like a cinematic approach to the life of Christ. So in creating this new kind of work, Cimabue must have been inspired, at least in part, by a type of croce dipinta, popular in the mid-13th century, where smaller passion scenes are placed on either side of Christ's body. This example, made in Pisa circa 1230 to 40 by an unknown artist and now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, features a Christus Triumphans, flanked by 6 scenes from Christ's Passion that can be read starting at left from top to bottom. The betrayal, the flagellation, try to point here for you guys, the way to Calvary, the deposition, the lamentation, and the 3 Marys at the tomb. A number of these narrative crosses can be traced to convents of the Four Clares, including this one, featuring the updated Christus Patiens made for the Clarissan convent in San Gimignano, near Siena, around 1260 by an artist called Coppo di Macrobaldo. The scenes chosen for Coppo's cross represent a shift, and here we're getting towards medieval Renaissance, towards stories that would further heighten a viewer's experience of Christ's human suffering. Now, instead of reading the scenes from bottom to top in this case, we read them from left to right. And so if we can start here, our eyes pass over Christ's body between narrative moments. So we have the betrayal, Christ before Pilate, the flagellation, the mocking of Christ, the ascension of the cross, and the lamentation. Now, you'll notice also that all of these scenes selected here spotlight Christ's humanity specifically, and not only the physical torture of his passion, but also his psychological pain in the betrayal and the mocking, as well as the grief that was felt by his followers. So the inclusion of these scenes invites viewers to journey moment by moment, imagining themselves as firsthand witnesses to the events shown, and also getting involved emotionally in those moments. And by the way, it was in San Gimignano, at the very Clarissan convent for which this cross was made, that the Meditations on the Life of Christ, the text I mentioned earlier, was composed some years later, probably around 1300 by a local friar. So in Coppo's cross, we see a kindred emphasis on episodic meditation designed to stir the emotions. Promise I'm getting close to the end here. The mocking of Christ is one of the passion narratives that becomes increasingly popular on crosses in the mid-13th century moment we're in here, as shown by Sandberg-Bavala, by the way. So the biblical event of the mocking of Christ is actually chronicled in two distinct accounts in the Gospels. The first is more properly termed the buffeting of Christ, and it happens just after the high priest's pronouncement that Christ is guilty of blasphemy. So an angry mob then blindfolds him, spits at him, and strikes him in the face. So this episode is sometimes referred to in modern scholarship as the Jewish mocking. And we'll see in a minute why. Another incident, known as the Roman mocking, happens after Christ appears before Pilate. In this instance, he's assaulted by soldiers who mock his claims of kingship. They give him a scepter and a crown of thorns. So 13th century painters often just put the two together. They would combine motifs from both accounts. And gradually they began favoring elements of the Jewish mocking, often incorporating the blindfold and leaving out the crown of thorns and the scepter. So Coppo's version is an example of this shift. Here, Christ is seated, blindfolded, tormented by onlookers, hitting him with staves, and by bearded figures blowing ram's horns or shofars, which are common period references to the Jews. Cimabue's mocking is a totally new take on this theme. Like Coppo, Cimabue leans towards the Jewish rather than the Roman mocking, but he forgoes the shofars, he leaves out the crown of thorns and the scepter. He does, importantly, I think, include a blindfold. While most other examples, like Coppo's, show Christ seated, Cimabue instead depicts Christ standing, jostled about by a large crowd. A tangle of 20 intertwined figures creates a visual puzzle of limbs and legs. We can relate to the blindfolded Christ's predicament. Our eyes strain to sort through this jumble to understand when a sword might slice into Christ's body or where a hand might rise to slap him. Cimabue's new take on this theme underscores the power of contemplating Christ's mental as well as physical pain, his disorientation, his uncertainty. These are inner struggles to which all of us as humans can relate. We see here how Cimabue revives a subject popularized on painted crosses, but translated into an even more intimate scene, prompting empathetic meditation and self-reflection. So the idea of painted crosses, to conclude, prompting introspection, is a theme we've seen throughout my lecture tonight. Whether it was in Francis's conversion to the religious life, prompted by an image of Christ on the cross, or Clare's conception of the crucified Christ as a mirror, or Cimabue's visual focus on Christ's humanity, the Croce Dipinta helped viewers think about their relationship to the sacred in novel ways. As I hope our investigation has suggested, the story of the changes in art that happened between medieval and Renaissance is complex, it's multifaceted, and involves various agents, including artists, patrons, and audiences. I hope to have underscored the contributions of women, especially the spirituality of the poor Clares, to this period. Clare's conception of the crucified Christ as a mirror of eternity recalls St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he famously invokes a mirror as a metaphor for the way Christians can only understand the divine imperfectly, as in a reflection in a mirror, dimly. As historians, when we look into the past, we are likewise searching for something we can only see dimly. But even in our imperfect glimpses into the past, hopefully we can shape how we relate to the divine, to the world, and most importantly, to ourselves. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Holly, thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful talk. It's so fantastic to really have this interdisciplinary material to do with this audience. And I really want to take the chance to welcome friends, colleagues, scholars, students from our department, art history, and film, but also from history, from classics, from theology, from philosophy, from other institutions around the Boston area. This has really been quite wonderful. So I want to take the opportunity to open up to some questions. Maybe while things are formulating, I might ask the first one, just because the Croce Dipinta as a genre of art is one that I find to be absolutely amazing. I hope that, thank you so much for the wonderful details that you've shown. And we're really truly lucky at BC to have this opportunity to have an example of a painted cross, painted crucifix upstairs. I just want to ask the first question, which has to do with this figure of Giunta Pisana.
Yes.
Okay, Giunta Pisana is something we've covered in our seminar earlier this year. I see some people smiling. Giunta is a particularly interesting figure because for about a 1,000-year period, we have no signatures. We have no works of art, virtually none, in which we have a artist being actually mentioned by name. The only other one that I can think of would be a piece from the 11th century, which is also painted cross. And so is there something about the painted cross as a genre that leads us to this idea of authorship that we really see as being one of the profound shifts from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance?
That is an excellent question, John. And I mean, we don't have a lot of signatures that survive, as you've already mentioned. So, but I think there is something. It's not surprising to me, though, that when the Giunta has, Giunta signs this cross, and that we have examples of painted crosses. Maybe I'd have to do sort of a more broad survey of what other types of objects, but it's in a way not surprising that the crucifix and the crucifixion and a painted cross becomes a vehicle for kind of this sense of identity and authorship, right? And an artist maybe wanting to associate themselves with this mirror of eternity, right? So I think it makes sense that artists who might be beginning to sign their works would maybe start with something like this. I mean, I think later you have someone like Duccio signing the base of the Maestà, saying right below the feet of the Virgin, like, here I'm Duccio, I'm the painter, I painted this to the glory of the Mother of God. So I think already in this period, we are seeing artists wanting to not only identify themselves as artists, but also to identify themselves with the sacred that's depicted, right? So.
Yes, it's so fascinating that just sometimes even in just Italian art, the origins of Italian art are oftentimes certainly spoken of as originating or coming from a figure like Giunta. And so to locate this specifically in the object of a painted cross is something that's really quite interesting. Yeah.
Holly, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really intrigued by your quotations from the letters from Clare that mentioned the mirror, and then you can back to it at the end of the discussion with the mirror as metaphor. The cross upstairs looks like maybe that it'll have silver leaf on it rather than my wonder. I don't know.
Oh, that is I love this idea. I love it.
And I was just curious, like mirrors in this time are sometimes made from silver polished river.
Right, yeah.
I think this certainly isn't the only cross that in the period made silver gilt.
Yeah.
This was silver gilt. Do you think there was ever artistic intention behind that? Or do we have other examples in which it seems likely that the artist was thinking about that? Because thinking that unlike many of the other examples you showed in this talk, which are both silver leaf could have a particular
Yeah, I absolutely love this idea. And I think that, I mean, even something like gold with the sense of reflection, right? The sense of sort of like, riches, obviously something that is appropriate for the splendor of God, but also the notion of light as and the reflection of light as a sense of enhancing this idea of the cross being and other types of, religious objects too, but being a way of helping you reflect, if you will, right? But but the silver leaf, that is a fabulous idea. I love that connection. So sounds reasonable to me. It would be fun to know also, because silver leaf tarnishes, so we don't get the survival that we do. I mean, gold also survives poorly, but we especially don't get the survival of silver leaf. So it would be interesting to know if more crosses like this did have silver leaf.
Appreciate greatly all the built-in plugs to the exhibition upstairs. Some other questions, please.
Thank you, Holly. That was wonderful. You mentioned the relic of the True Cross at Santa Croce, and that is something that we talked about in my class.
Oh, yeah.
And when you were discussing, you mentioned that, and then you were discussing the Santa Croce crucifix and just how tangible his body is and how tangible that fabric is, and the kind of play between revealing and concealing. Do we know how that relic was kept? Was it kept on the altar below the cross? The relationship between the relic and its display and this cross. And I just wonder if because relics, of course, are tangible themselves, if we know anything about the attraction to.
We do not, in this period, we don't know, we don't have the surviving reliquary of that moment, unfortunately. So, and we don't know about the proximity of the reliquary to the cross, but it would be amazing to know. It would be amazing to know more. And I think that sense of tangibility, and also, I mean, something I didn't mention, but it kind of goes without saying, is that these Croce Dipinta, they're made of wood also, right? So in terms of the materiality of, I think that, and the tangibility, in the sense that wood is also the wood that Christ was, crucified on. It's an important consideration. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
People are continuing to formulate. Yes, here we go. Jonathan.
I think I can just speak about this. But thank you so much for that very beautiful and provocative talk. And since we have this picture of, I love what you had to say about the gossamer loincloth, revealing, emphasizing the flesh of Christ. But I also want to point out something that's more material in here, which is the blood that is kind of oozing down and coagulating and gathering on as a kind of almost trompe-l'oeil illusionistic motif on the ledge of the cross, or the illusionistic ledge of the cross. And since Christ's incarnation, his flesh comes from the blood of Mary's womb, it is possibly this coagulating blood may also be another way of emphasizing the incarnation.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And I love that. And I really love also how you brought up the way that it coagulates and collects on that ledge is very illusionistic. And, something I was able to go into, I'm not about the blood. I love this idea. So this is, I'm going to footnote you, but I love the fact, and I didn't get to point it out in this talk. I was kind of trying to do a lot, as you saw, but the loincloth also comes out of the frame here. I don't know, hopefully you can see that here in this detail. I didn't quite get the detail right here, but so there is a sense of this, again, medieval Renaissance, right? This idea of the encroachment into the viewer's space, right, and the sense of three-dimensionality, and also then these again very tangible material components of the crucifixion that are become very real and to us, which is amazing. So, thank you.
Matt, please.
I can ask, but I was curious about the mocking.
Mm.
In the middle of the background, there's a little mark, it's like the remains of the inscription.
Mm.
What is that?
Let me see.
Like,
Yes, so it is the remains of an inscription. Yes, so we do think there were, we know that there were inscriptions on each of the panels. So, and there are other examples of, you probably know some of them, but where the narrative scenes are articulated, right? What they tell us what they are, right? We get an inscription. So, thinking of the triptych in Trieste, for example, that has those inscriptions. So, often they don't survive. They're added later and they come off more easily. So, or I think sometimes the taste was not, or they weren't surviving well. They probably sometimes get cleaned off potentially as well. But, yeah.
I'd like to ask one more question now about access.
Yes.
We'll for sure look for photo in 2019. I'll give you a chance to see the Cimabue painting in Paris. I think it's really interesting, especially for students, to learn about the logistics of medieval art, the logistics of studying these paintings. Some things that experiences you have and what it's like to get access to these objects, sometimes in monastic communities.
Yes, well, I often say that my Italian is good so that I can talk my way into a chapel or into a cloister. That I can talk to nuns. Actually, talking to nuns a lot in Italy is it can be tricky. So knowing Italian is like the first step, so it helps a lot. So because there are still cloister communities in Italy, and they are not always willing to, have their spaces. They're living religious spaces, right? They don't think of them the same way that historians think of them. So you have to be persuasive and try to do what you can and have to do to be able to get access. So it can be tricky. And for things in private collections, it's a different set of trickiness, which is why when I found out about the painting in Paris, I immediately had to go and check it out. And so, but now I'm very grateful that the French government decided to buy it and it was going to go in private hands, and they were able to finagle the cash that they needed to acquire it, which is great. So it's a happy ending to the story.
I think it's about time we move to the logistics of celebrating Holly for.
I think so.
the talk.
Time for wine.
Please join us for your reception.
Thank you.